We very much appreciate it. I think you're going to be delighted with our speakers today. Thank you. All right. I just want to give a quick message on the format. We have two speakers today. They have very interesting and different stories to share. Our first speaker will be speaking for 10 to 15 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for maybe 5 minutes of Q&A. And then our second speaker will be speaking for 10 or 15, and then another 5 minutes for Q&A. So it's really, the title, Congregants Hour, is a little misleading. It's about 45 minutes, but I didn't think anyone would be hurt with that. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lisa Follner, who is an accomplished ophthalmologist, a highly skilled surgeon, and I think we all know, a member for more than 20 years. And she will be telling her story, the title, Sephardic versus Ashkenazi, the Hatfields and McCoys of Judaism.
Thanks, Melissa. Am I on? I don't think this might be. Oh, that might be too tall for me. It is. I'm going to sit where I don't feel so short and can actually see over it. I'm happy right here. So thank you for all being here. When Melissa asked me to tell the story of my relationship with Judaism, I asked her, why me? I couldn't imagine why anyone would be interested in my story. Surely there are so many more interesting stories out there, better Jews than I am, stories that people would want to hear. As Melissa and I talked, I realized that my journey with Judaism may or may not be unique, but it molded who I have become and how I raised my children. Today, I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version, and for those of you who know me, keeping it short is difficult. For some of you, it will seem to drag on, and maybe for others, you will want to hear more. For me, writing this in preparation got very personal and a little bit emotional. And for those of you who know me, it's very rare that I can talk about things personal without actually crying. So if I make it through, we'll be lucky. I believe that many of you have stories about your lives and your journey through Judaism, and that we all need to hear them. Thanks to Melissa, we hopefully will have the honor and the opportunity to do just that. I recently watched a movie called The Swimmers. This is a story about Yusra Mardini and her sister. Yusra is a Syrian former competitive swimmer and a refugee of the Syrian civil war. Her story is of great bravery, commitment, and determination when at the age of 18, she left the Syrian civil war. She left the war-torn Syria and made her way to Europe and eventually the Olympics. I won't spend a lot of time telling you Yusra's story because after all, this is all about me, right? I do urge you to see the movie or read about her story. It changed many things about the way I viewed my life, about the way I thought I struggled, about the sacrifices I felt like I had made. It changed my view about my family and about my work and the world that I live in. It put my life into perspective and the importance and value of learning people's stories, people we know and people we meet. There is so much we assume when we see or meet people, but listening to a person's story shows us who they really are, the struggles they have overcome, and enlightens us to experiences we may never have, and expands our view and perspectives of our own lives and the world. So why the Hatfields and McCoys? I didn't actually come up with that title, Melissa did. But my story starts long before me. It starts with my parents and their parents and their parents' parents, and long before that. And so long that I brought my great-grandfather's talit with me. And I wish I could wear it, but it's rather time-worn. But it reminds me of that my story is so old as many of yours and begins long before any of us were on this earth. My parents were both immigrants. My mom was born in 1927 in England and moved to the United States shortly after World War II in 1950. She was the daughter of an extremely wealthy Orthodox Jewish family, her father Italian and her mother French-Belgian. My mom was dark hair, dark skin. I used to tease her that she could walk by a window and turn brown. In her family, women were meant to learn to cross-stitch, be silent, and get married. They weren't allowed to play sports or become educated. My father was born in 1920 and emigrated to the United States from Kiev, Ukraine, as a very small child. He was the youngest of 5 children and the only boy. His family spoke Yiddish at home and lived in the slums of Atlantic City. Being Jewish in his family was a way of life, but not life itself like it was for my mom. Both of my parents battled with their relationship with Judaism. My mother felt suppressed by the restrictions the religion put on her. She wanted to be an athlete and go to college. She was evacuated from England in 1941 and lived with a foster family in Montreal until after the war. There, she lived a different kind of life, where women were independent and educated, and her relationship with her family and Judaism changed after that. My father returned from the war in Germany and stopped believing in God. He felt that there couldn't be a God who would let such horror happen. My mother left England against the will of her parents, for which she was disowned, to come to America and go to the University of Pennsylvania, where she met my father, who was there on the GI Bill. He was the first and only member of his family to go to college. They met and married, and a few years later started a family, and this is where I come in. I'm the youngest of 3 and the only girl. Growing up with parents from a different country always made me feel different. My home life was not like any of my friends or my extended family. It wasn't a typical American home. We didn't have much of my mom's family local because her sister lived in Montreal and her brother in London. My father's family, on the other hand, lived very close to us. I didn't really understand why, but my father's family didn't really include us in anything. I knew that my father's family didn't like my mother. His sisters excluded her from everything and thereby excluded my brothers and me. We didn't really have cousins that we were close to, despite the large family on my dad's side. I thought it was because my mother came from a wealthy family, was British with a funny accent, or that she was educated and none of them were. I just knew we were always on the outside, and I so much wanted to be part of it. It wasn't until I watched this series, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. I promise you I do more than just watch TV. And the reason for all of this became much clearer. The fact that she was British and educated probably played a role in her isolation, but there was something deeper. In the time when my parents met in the 1950s, Sephardic Jews did not marry Ashkenazi Jews. Historically, there was a strong cultural conflict between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. More than 7 decades have passed since the establishment of Israel. But to this day, in Israel, the socioeconomic and political gap between these two groups of Jews exists and has grown. Traditionally, in Sephardic families, the father was the patriarch, much like in my mother's family, with generations of family members living close together, and the family trade being part of the culture and family center. Jewish women were not educated and stayed at home. Sephardic Jews had a second-class label. The primarily European Ashkenazi society was permeated with a sense of superiority, primarily because they came from educationally, technologically, and politically advanced European countries. During this time, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews were completely separated, with Sephardics considered lower class. Watching this program opened Pandora's box for me to learn about the complexity of this relationship. For me as a Jew was a Jew. I was taught that all Jews were connected. I know now that this separation existed in America, and my father's light-haired, light-eyed family were discriminating and even racist against my dark-skinned, dark-haired mother, and therefore her children. It all makes sense to me now. In this country, for the most part, we have moved beyond this Hadfield and McCoy relationship. But in Israel and in the very religious communities, it persists. Here, in this synagogue, we have united as a minority to give us the strength and unity needed to survive in a still very anti-Semitic world. This archaic conflict between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews contributed to my feelings as a kid of being less than and wanting to fit somewhere. I wanted to fit with this family and my community of friends, but I always felt slightly on the outside. My Jewish friends all belonged to the same synagogue and went to the same Hebrew school. Their parents were all American, and they had lots of things, clothing, toys. But my parents valued education, art, music, family, and travel. We didn't have what my mom called stuff. We could have as many books as we wanted, but just not stuff. So I didn't fit in with the family, and I didn't exactly fit with my friends. My parents were so different. Our Jewish home was even different because of the experience my parents brought with them. We understood that we were Jewish, that it was important and something to be proud of, but more from a cultural rather than a religious perspective. We celebrated the holidays, we went to services on the high holy days, and I even went to Hebrew school far away from my home. But we didn't belong to a synagogue, and life at home was culturally, but not religiously Jewish. I so wanted to fit somewhere, and being Jewish was an entrance into a world that I was already automatically part of. I loved Hebrew school. I loved my rabbi. I was starved for information about being Jewish, and so much wanted to be that my connection to belonging. And that was the wonderful thing. When I opened my heart and my mind to Judaism, with the help of a very special rabbi, my life made more sense. And the thread of that connection became more important than all the things that made me feel different. I felt blessed. Blessed for the connection I can't put into words. Blessed to have the relationship with God that I didn't inherit. Blessed that then and now it brings me joy and peace. When I got married to a non-Jew, the only terms were that any children we had would be raised Jewish. Lucky for me, I met a man who not only accepted that, but supported that decision 100%. In my parents' prayer for my children on their bat and bar mitzvah, I told them to never be afraid to reach for their dreams and never be afraid to fail because they had a net of family, friends, and a Jewish community to catch them if they fall. That thread we have that binds us, this being Jewish, being part of a tribe, is a real thing. It matters and it's important. I know that no matter where I am in the world, I can find a Jew, and that community makes me connected to them. When I was 20, I backpacked through Europe for a year by myself. In every city, I found a synagogue and a family that would take me in for a meal, Shabbat, or a holiday. Sometimes we didn't speak the same language, but it really didn't matter. I felt like I belonged and was safe. We're so lucky to have that. Some of you know that every time I walk into the sanctuary, I cry. Literally every time. I really don't know why. Sometimes I think it's because I've been a bad Jew and I haven't been there enough, so I'm guilty. Sometimes I think it's because I miss all the people that are gone and being there reminds me of those losses. Sometimes I think of those tears are just from sheer emotion of being here and feeling that connection. Sometimes I think it's because it reminds me that there is so much I still don't know about being a Jew that I missed out on because of the experiences my parents had and the influence it had on my upbringing. Each time I promise myself that I'm going to be a better Jew, come to Shabbat services more often, get involved, take all the classes to teach me what I missed along the way, but I don't. Every year on Yom Kippur, I promise myself that the next year will be different. I tell myself that when I retire, I'll have time and it will be different. It's in my heart and I know I need it to be whole. Because it's Yom Kippur, I have the luxury of asking for forgiveness for my shortfallings and promise that this time next year, it will be different. I know I have time and that this temple will be here because of the work of others for me when I am ready. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for welcoming me with open arms no matter how long it's been. Thank you for accepting my family as one of your own. Thank you for making sure this wonderful temple is here for our small community of Jews. Please tell me your stories. I truly want to hear them. Some of your stories will overlap and some will be totally unique. All of them are truly part of the book of life and a chapter in our Jewish story that needs to be shared, spoken, and heard. If I have one more minute, I'd like to just share the conclusion of my mother's story, who felt very far away from Judaism for most of her life after she left England. My father died in 2011, and I moved my mother down here from Philadelphia. At the time, my youngest was still in the religious school here, and I was ever present here, as it should always be. And it made me sad that I couldn't share that with my mom, and that she didn't feel what I felt as a Jew. But fortunately, the synagogue has an incredible sisterhood, and I started bringing my mother to Shabbat services and introduced her to many of the women in the sisterhood who, a lot of them are gone now. And she found her place in Judaism again, in this synagogue. Unfortunately, she died within a year of being here. But in that year, she found her Jewishness, she found her sisterhood. And Rabbi Gila was at her side when she passed. And for me, it was probably the most meaningful time as a Jew to see my mom come back to something that's so important to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was very moving and compelling. You're not off the hook yet, though, because I did want to open it up for maybe 5 minutes of questions and answers if anyone has any questions for Lisa. Yes, Anne?
I know that your children are now young adults.
Oh.
Awesome. I know that your kids are now young adults, so I'm wondering how much of your story do they know and have you shared with them?
So it's really interesting. Both of my kids know the story. I'm very sentimental, and my home is filled with my history. I never knew my grandparents, but my home is filled with their story. And it's really interesting because my daughter is not very Jewish. She knows she's Jewish, but doesn't feel that connection. But my son is very Jewish, and I texted both of them kind of snarky, and on Rosh Hashanah I said, so, Shana Tova, I know you guys are both at services, and my daughter wrote back LOL, and my son wrote back, actually I am.
Anyone else?
Yeah, we don't want to use this so that people who are on YouTube can hear us. Otherwise they can't.
Lisa, thank you. That was a great story.
Thank you.
Have you or your kids connected at all with your father's family?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Part of it also is that my dad was 43 when I was born. He went through World War II, then put himself through college with the GI Bill, then, established himself, got married. His sisters were all married at 17. So all of my first cousins are much older than me. And we have reconnected, and it's interesting, COVID did that the most for us, because they, among themselves, developed a cousins Zoom meeting. Well, they couldn't leave me and my brother out because we're on the email, right? Because we're all the cousins. And through that, during COVID, we would meet once a month. And I got to know them because of that. I got to know them better, and we still meet on Zoom now we have one in October coming up. So yeah, I think part of it is that my next youngest cousin is 17 years older than me, but we have reconnected, so yeah.
So we probably have time for one more question.
Where in Atlantic City?
Oh, okay.
Oh my goodness. I don't know the street. They had a property, and my dad used to work at an orangeade stand on Steel Pier. I don't really know what street they lived on.
Probably close to each other.
Nice.
Probably.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. All right. So I just want to take a quick moment to introduce our second speaker. Vadim Mizhen was born in the former Soviet Union, and he came to the United States when he was 16 years old.
It's a privilege and an honor to speak to you. So thank you for that opportunity. I was born in Minsk, former Soviet Union, and I grew up in Minsk. By 1980, when I was 16 years old, my dad had enough. He had enough of anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, anti-Semitism in particular, and horrific oppression of the individual in general. He began his journey to that realization from fairly young age. He was a true believer in the cause of communism. That's how he was raised, and even cried when Stalin died. But as he entered the workforce, as he began to live his life, he began to realize that it was all a lie. And by the mid-70s, he started to talk to my mom and started to talk to other relatives, mostly on my mom's side, because they needed to be convinced for my mom to be convinced. Well, nobody would listen to him, but he persisted, and by 1980, he finally convinced my mom. So he rounded up the family, and he truly was our Moses. And I will forever be grateful to my dad. He passed 2 years ago. So by 1980, he rounded up the family, and we set out from Minsk to the promised land. Baltimore, Maryland? But all joking aside, it was a promised land. It was an amazing transformation. It was the most transformative experience of my life at 16 years of age, and it defines me to this day. Being a Jew in the Soviet Union is very different from being a Jew in this beautiful country. It's not about celebrating openly Jewish holidays. It's not about going to a synagogue. It's not about studying and having a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah. It's not about eating Chinese food and going to the movies on Christmas Day. None of that. The things I listed and many others are what I would call pleasant, meaningful Judaism. That was not what being a Jew in the Soviet Union was. I left at 16, and I began to understand many things. I understood many more things as I became older. But even by that time, I constantly felt that being a Jew was a weird mix of pride, feeling good about it, and not ever wanting to give it up. But at the same time, it was a huge weight, just really heavy weight. And you never wanted to advertise being a Jew. You always wanted to fit in. I did. I know all other Jews did as well. But somehow they always knew. They always knew. And my being a Jew was mostly about them telling me that I'm a Jew. And they would tell it to me not in very kind ways. Even people who were my friends, I'm talking about elementary school age kids. You play on the playground, you play soccer, you do stuff. As soon as there was a disagreement, a serious disagreement, you get into shoving situation or even a verbal disagreement, the word kike was pulled out of their pocket. And you always anticipated that. It didn't always happen, but you always anticipated that, and you always prepared yourself for that. And it kind of numbs you to that after a while, because you gotta have friends, you gotta be with people, and you always kind of began to accept that that's their fault. And as I got older, And as I came to this country and I understood how Jews are treated in this country, although there are problems, but nothing compared to what it was like in the Soviet Union, I understood that people there get it with their mother's milk. They truly do. They don't understand what it is, but they just want to say it. They want to use it against you. So that's how I grew up. I remember vividly a few episodes. One of them was with a friend at camp. I went to the same overnight or sleepover camp for many years, many summers, and I would spend 1 or 2 months at a time at that camp. And there was a kid, many kids, but one kid in particular who I became really good friends with. We did not communicate outside of camp, especially when we were, 7, 8, 9 years old. But I would see him in camp 6, 7 summers in a row. And I remember one time when I was 14 years old or so, the kid finally pulled out that word against me. And it just stung. But I said to myself, well, it's no different from anybody else. It was just so common. I remember another episode very well. When I was in 6th grade, I went to a different school. I went to a new school. Believe it or not, I played basketball, and there was a class of just basketball players being formed in the city of Minsk. And kids who had been playing basketball and who were selected for the class were all brought to the same school. So we could all practice a lot and go to school a little bit. And I was the shortest kid in class, including girls. And it was about 3rd or 4th day of school. And we were out and about, and I got into an unpleasant conversation with a girl who all of a sudden says, "Kike." And I'm thinking, wow, this is like 4 days in. How does she know who I am? That really what got me interested. Not the fact that she said that word, but how does she know? So I find out, I had never known this, but I found out that there was a class journal. This is 1976, 77. There was a class journal for every class. And by the way, we went to every class with the same group of 30 people, just like elementary school in the US. We didn't so we had math together, history together. Everybody had the same curriculum. So this class journal traveled from class to class, and that's where grades were recorded. And at the end of the class journal, everybody's, they call it nationality, was listed. So if you were Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, being a Jew was a nationality. You couldn't practice Judaism. So a Jew was a nationality. So sure enough, at the end of the class journal, there's my name and my nationality, Jew. So, okay. Another very interesting thing about that class, there was a kid, Lenny Cherniak. I still keep in touch with him. And I became really, really close friends with him. And I never knew that he was half Jewish. I only found out several years later. We were going to a competition, and we needed to give our coach birth certificates. And when the birth certificates were given back to us, the coach asked, "Hey, can you give it to Lenny?" Knowing that we're really good friends. And on birth certificates too, one's nationality was indicated. It was everywhere. And that's how I found out he was a Jew. I want to return to my dad. Conversations about being Jewish started fairly early, but my parents were very careful in how they approached the topic, because if the locals find out, if the authorities find out, you could get in trouble, depending on what you said. So my dad I had to earn his trust, as did my brother. So it was 4 people in the family: my mom, my dad, my brother, who is 5 years older, and me. And we had to earn his trust. It was only toward the time that we left that I found out that my dad had read an illegal copy of Exodus by Leon Uris. It was a manuscript copy, typewritten manuscript copy, that he had given. I kind of resented that because he had given it to my brother, but he didn't give it to me. But I got to read the book later on my own, in English, of all things. But it was a banned book. I remember asking my parents, it was during Yom Kippur, around Yom Kippur. I didn't know it was Yom Kippur, but it was the time of the Yom Kippur War, 1973. And we're listening to radio at breakfast, and the radio was just spewing filth at Israel. And I listened. I said to my mom and dad, "Is this true?" And they were really careful. They kind of talked to me to get their point across. But at the end of that, they said, "Don't tell anybody we talked about this." I said, "Not telling anybody." So in the Soviet Union, just a few more words about that before I get to Pikesville. Jews were restricted. There were quotas on college admissions. Jews were not allowed to practice certain professions, or if they were really, really good, they were allowed into those professions because they were really, really good. But they had to be better than those they competed against to get into those professions. Then 1980 happened, and we came to Pikesville. What an experience. We came in July of 1980, and we settled in Pikesville because that's where the Jewish community was. And I want to start with the scariest experience of my life. It was the scariest then. It remains the scariest experience of my life. The walk to the bus stop when school began. I did not speak a word of English. Well, by then I spoke some words of English. But I spoke very poor English at the time. I was 16 years old. Had no idea what to expect. And that was the longest walk I had ever taken, even though it was about 2 minutes. Thankfully, playing sports got me introduced to the cool people at the school. And I got to know really good kids. I remember a few weeks into the school year, I'm standing by my locker, and 2 kids approached me who don't look like they play sports. And they asked me, "Hey, we hear you're from the Soviet Union, you're from Russia." I said, "Yeah, I am." I said, "Hey, you want to join the chess club?" I said, "No, I'll play basketball and soccer." Then another interesting experience happened a month later. The first Jewish holidays in the United States, it was about September of 1980. Again, I walked to the bus stop. Now I had been doing it for about a month, and there's nobody at the bus stop. So I wait. The bus doesn't come. I go back home. My dad is still home before going to work. And I said to Dad, "Hey, can you drive me to school? There's no bus." So my dad gets into his car. He drives me to school. I come to school. The parking lot is empty. Nobody's at school. Then I learned it's Yom Kippur. And it's Pikesville High School. Pikesville High School, it was about 95% Jewish. It was the most puzzling, shocking thing I had ever imagined. I remember sitting at the lunch table with a bunch of kids. Again, I didn't speak English all that well. And the kids are talking Jewish stuff, and somebody told a Jewish joke, and I'm looking around like, is this real? And there was a kid, Richard Hyatt. I became good friends with him fairly quickly. And I said, Rich, I don't understand. And he says, everybody's Jewish at the table. I said, really? And then I realized that in my school there were 6 Kaplans, 8 Cohens, and many others. And then I started to learn about my friends. I started to get to know their families. And after a while, I began to be convinced that just like in the Soviet Union, Jews in the US were restricted to certain professions. And those were being a doctor, lawyer, or a scrap metal business owner. In my school, there were about 8 families that owned scrap metal businesses. I kid you not. This country amazed me from day one. It's got its problems, but it's an amazing concept, in my opinion. And it continues to amaze me to this day. 2 things constantly stand out in my mind. One, I remember in 1985, Yasser Arafat applied for a visa to enter the United States to come speak at the United Nations. And it was the Reagan administration, and George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State, denied him the visa. And Yasser Arafat sued the United States government in the courts of the United States. I said, he's got no chance. And the court ruled against the United States government and allowed Arafat to come to the UN and speak. And I said, this is an amazing place. That's one thing that stands out. Another thing that stands out throughout all these 40-plus years is that a whole aisle at a giant food store is devoted just to cereal. I kid you not. I still go into Giant, and I sometimes visit that aisle, and I look, and I'm amazed. To summarize, for me as a Jew, the difference between the Soviet Union and the United States is that in the Soviet Union, what Jews practiced is what I would call defensive Jewishness. It's not Judaism, it's Jewishness. You don't go to shul, you don't practice Judaism. You always defend yourself. And that is contrasted with what we practice here, which is pleasant Judaism. And I just wish that we forever will be practicing pleasant Judaism and never have to go back to defensive Jewishness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vadim. Don't go anywhere. Because I'd like to open it up for a 5-minute Q&A. Yes, Rabbi Mika? Oh, wait, we need a microphone.
Not for YouTube.
Kakadillah.
Хорошо.
So, I wanted to ask you, when my father's family lived in Ukraine and they were prosecuted, which is why my grandparents ended up going to Israel before Israel was Israel, and it was Palestine. But there was a period of time that they had to change their last name to conceal their Jewishness. And so they changed it from Levin, which is my maiden name, to Lievin. I am wondering if your family had to make any kind of adjustments to conceal their Jewishness.
People tried to do it. There was no way to change last names because by the time of my life, the Soviet Union had pretty good registration protocols and records, but people scrambled not to have that Jewish in their passport, which was in one's passport, or in the class journal, or in your birth certificate. I'll give you the example of my very close relatives, my cousins. My father's sister is married to a man whose last name is very Jewish. His last name is Franklach. And that was his father's name, but his mother was Russian. So his kids, who are my first cousins, are all Franklach, which is very Jewish, but they're all Russian because he took, my uncle took his mother's nationality, and his kids could take his nationality. So people try to find ways, but the funny thing is, by late 1970s, when Jewish immigration started to be allowed out of the Soviet Union, it was just a trickle back then, the floodgates opened late 80s. People started to scramble back to find Jewish roots so they could present to the Soviet government. Only Jews were being allowed to immigrate because according to 1972 Helsinki Agreement, basically was trading Jews for grain, but officially there was the Helsinki Agreement that Jews could immigrate. And people started scrambling, trying to find Jewish roots. So it was very interesting. It was the reversal. And some of it was happening actually with the war in Ukraine. Everybody was trying to find the Jewish connection so they could leave Ukraine and go to Israel. So that has happened consistently over the last 40 years, including most recently with Ukraine. But yes, that was definitely a thing. Try to hide your being Jewish.
So is Jen specifically Jewish name?
It's not. My mom's maiden name is Ginsburg. My dad's last name comes from, he is hailing from a small town in Ukraine, and everybody in that small town, like, I don't know, 40 families, they all had that last name. Nobody could spell it in the Soviet Union either. So it's not Jewish.
So great question. Anyone else? Yes, Nick?
So I know Belarus can be a difficult destination, but have you been back? Since
I have been back, and I meant, thank you for asking me, because I meant to mention that in my story. The first time I went back was in 2005, 25 years later. Lenny Cherniak found me on the internet. So within a month, I was there. He got together about 24 out of 30 people from that class. We all got together, and there was one woman, my former classmate. You remember I mentioned they always wait to pull out that word at you. And so I gave a toast. So she gets up and she says, "You speak like an old Jew." And had that been said to me when I was 16, my heart would just squeeze and I would be just made to feel so small. I said to myself, oh, I feel very different now. So I said to her, well, I agree with you on one point, I disagree with you on the other. I am a Jew, but I'm not that old. So it felt really good.
Great, thank you. Any others? Yes, Phil's over here.
I don't want to bust your bubble, but there's so much anti-Semitism around now. I live in Cecil County. When I moved over there, 20 years ago, never forget, my neighbor was a religious Christian. She came, my wife had friends who came over to help us clean up the house. To clean up the house. and one of them was black and one of them was gay. And after they left, they were helping us paint the inside of the house. Mrs. White comes over and says, you know, we don't allow Jews and blacks in this neighborhood. Just like that. You know, she didn't know we were Jewish at this time. And thank God she moved. And I have very good neighbors now. But anti-Semitism is nowhere gone in this country. If you move, I think there are 2 Jews in Cecil County. And that's it.
I'll just say to that, there's a really qualitative difference between Mrs. White coming over and saying that versus government-sponsored anti-Semitism. And that is the difference that makes all the difference.
Can I say something about that?
Yes,
I
please.
have
Up
to
the
say
microphone.
that may be so. We don't know what it's like to live with overt government-sponsored anti-Semitism. But my whole life, even though my community was maybe 50% Jewish, teachers were anti-Semitic. I had a teacher call me a dirty Jew one day in class, and I told my parents, and they wanted to go to school and tell the school that this guy did this. This is my typing teacher. It's the only D I ever got in my entire life. And I was afraid to have them go to the school and complain because I didn't want to be singled out. I had Jewish friends who hid their Judaism, even when I grew up. I had a friend, her name was Claire Rothschild. I said, how are you ever going to hide your Judaism? Like, your name is Jewish. I had kids, and I don't really know where this came from, but throw pennies at me at school. I don't know what the whole penny thing is, but it had to do with being Jewish. And so, although it wasn't our government, it was still very personal, and it still happens today. And so whether our government is overtly anti-Semitic, even the smallest act against the smallest Jew is painful. We don't live under a shadow of the weight that you lived under, but I still think that as Jews, we live in a world. I know when I moved to Harford County, I went to the grocery store to buy matzah. And this is 24 years ago. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And so I went up to the service desk and I said, can you tell me where to buy matzah? And they were like, I don't know what that is. And I said, you know, the thin Jewish bread. And they said, go look in the ethnic aisle. I'm like, really? The ethnic aisle? I'm like, okay. So while, again, I don't know what it's like to live under overt government anti-Semitism, I think we live in a very anti-Semitic world still. And I think that the more we talk about it, and the more we stand up and don't hide our Judaism, hopefully things will change, although I have my doubts. Sorry, I just felt strongly about that.
All right, we probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more. Yes, Brad? Okay, perfect.
I just got one. So you're right, and I think the difference here, Micah? Yeah, the difference is here that you can find an agent. You can find an agent to help you. My kids, Havre de Grace Middle School, Havre de Grace High, they were getting harassed for being Jewish. And my kids, one's 27, one's 32. It's not that long ago. We found the right person, took the kid to the principal. The principal ferreted it out and told him to knock it off. That's the difference here.
Absolutely.
You can find the agent on your side. God bless America. You know,
Absolutely.
Russia, the hellhole for Jews.
Absolutely.
And it still is. And you watching over your shoulder, and why are we always like this? Because they're leaning on us. But there is a difference in America, and we're lucky. We're lucky to be here.
Yeah, to me the difference is that we all have the freedom of speech, and that's the most fundamental thing in my view. So let those who want to speak hatefully, let them speak. You want to know who they are, by the way, so let them speak. In the Soviet Union, it was the government that hated you. It was the government that drove all those things. Here, if you want to be a doctor and you're a Jew, go be a doctor. Not so in the Soviet Union. So that is an extremely important difference to me.
Okay, one more question. Great, Terry.
As most of you know, I deal with travel, and I found very early on at the age of 21, it opened my eyes to many things that went on in this world. I started off in Northern Ireland, lived there for a year, and then a long period of time took place. I went to Israel for the first time 6 years ago. When I got off the plane, I literally bent down, I know it's hard to believe, and I kissed the ground. Because I felt like for the first time in my entire life, after having grown up in Pikesville, that I came home. And as a result, I traveled some more, and I went to Central Europe for a 2-week tour, and that is what really opened my eyes to anti-Semitism, what my people went through. I cried all through the camp. I cried through every country. I felt like we're all children of God. How can this happen? And that's what travel has taught me, that it does happen, and you can look past that.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes our very first Congregants Hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank our two speakers, and I wish everyone an easy fast.